is Łukasz Ruściel, and it's a pleasure to meet you all on my presentation. Let's start with some short introduction. First of all, probably I don't need to tell you what the AP platform is, and I will force you to raise the hands. But perhaps some of you do not know what the Cilius is. This way. Cilius is there anyone who does not know what the Cilius is? So Cilius is a e-commerce framework that 2 years ago we decided to integrate with API platform as a new way of developing our API. For the long time we had integration with FastRest that was a little bit old and not suited for all of the use cases. Therefore we decided that it's good moment to revamp it. And AP platform seems to be a perfect choice for us, so that's why we decided to go for it. It took us some time, we learned a lot, and I would like today to share with you these ideas. But as today is a special day for all of you, and especially for AP platform team, as today you publish the version 3.0 of AP platform. The truth is that 2 days ago, we also celebrate another anniversary at Cilius, and we celebrate a 5th anniversary of our first stable release. And for that, please give me a moment. I would like to celebrate it. Not that small. So if anyone would like to join me before tonight's celebration, please catch me after the presentation. For now, let's cheers, Santa. Cheers. Once again, my congratulations to AP Platform team for their tremendous work with AP Platform 3.0, and I'm just happy that it's 5 years already with Cilius and our stable release. Moving on to the main point of the presentation. Our integration started 2 years ago. It's still an experimental, so still some stuff may change, but we are planning to do something similar that AP platform did. So we plan to release the next minor release during our conference, CiliusCon, that will be in 1 month, but we already want to support 2.7. And the next version will be supporting AP Platform 3.0, and it will be stabilized. We already, that's some spoiler alerts. We already cover about 100% of shop functionalities and 70% of all of them. Okay. Let's move on to the content of the presentation itself. Before I split this presentation into a few parts, and the first one that we will discuss is strategic design. Before I will jump into it, this presentation wouldn't be possible with ADRs, so architecture decision records that we are tracking in the repository. Same as doing API platform, and just totally recommend you to do it as well, but it's more about the architecture of the project, so it's not covered by the presentation. Just ask AP platform or me what the ADR is. Let's move on to the first question that was pretty important at the beginning of our integration. GraphQL or REST? Is there anyone here who would favor GraphQL in the new project? Okay. The truth is that 2 years ago, GraphQL was skyrocketing, at least it was super hyped, and we were really into doing it this way. But the question is it still? At the end, if we check some trends over Google, GraphQL never reached the potential of REST in terms of queries. What is more, recently GitHub also announced that some GraphQL endpoint GraphQL will be deprecated for some of his packages. So you can see that the trend is not that in favor of GraphQL anymore. But is it dying? I wouldn't also not say so, as there are Vue Storefront and other projects that use it, GraphCMS, etc. So GraphQL will be with us, but REST is maintaining much better position, at least in my opinion right now. So of course I do not need to cover too much that what GraphQL solves is overfetching and underfetching, that everything is built there with POST. It has typed nice documentation and allow you to gracefully deprecate the queries, while with REST, we may solve almost the same issues with additional libraries, with the spare fields or Vulkan from Kevin. We can take advantage of 20 years of cache development, that much easier at least. We have typed nice documentation with OpenAPI. That API platform is also doing great job for us, and for us it was one of the game changer that our API reference is always up to date with the code. And of course, we can gracefully deprecate some entities with OpenAPI and Sunset header. 2 years ago, when we were deciding for the REST, the idea that REST will be better solution wasn't that easy to make, especially that probably GraphQL would make Cilius project a little bit more hyped. Yet, 2 years later, we totally do not regret this decision. You can partially use GraphQL thanks to API platform, but due to some extensive serializer context builders, it's not that easy, so some additional work is needed there. But for now, we want to focus on delivering a really robust first class REST API, and then perhaps in the future we'll think about GraphQL itself. Moving on to something much more into code itself, let's discuss resources design. So when you have resources, there are that sometimes are not that easy to cover. My first case is about state transition. Entities during its lifetime changes its behavior. Sometimes we have some states or some current life state of the object written there, and based on this state, possible. Let's take an example and let's discuss canceling of an order. This is operation that is super important in any store because the customer can just decide not to go with this ordering anymore, and you need, as an administrator, way to cancel it. And what are the possibilities to do such a thing with API? First of all, pretty straightforward. We can update our order with a state that will say canceled. Of course, this is a possible solution. However, as in Cilius, we are using state machine. It's not about the goal, so end state, it's about the journey, so the transition that we are reaching the given state. Because with the state machine, you can reach the same end result through the different transitions. This presentation is also not about state machines, so shameless auto-promotion. I already did some state machine presentation if you need one, but let's focus just on the making states or transition between them. So this is something that would work, but it's not going to work for us because we need to say that we don't want to make state canceled, we want to make a transition to the cancel state. So perhaps we can add a verb at the end of the path. At the end, this is exactly what we want to do. So we want to update order with the transition to cancel. And I'm surprised that no one is yelling at me that it's not REST, it's not a proper solution. So of course we would have empty body in this case, but it's not REST, some may say. If we'll dig deep enough, we can find out that there's something like RESTful archetypes, which define 4 archetypes for that. Document, which is just a resource itself. Collection, so store or actually server managed collection of items that we can only read. A store, which is the client managed set of things. And the last one is controller. And the controller allows you to add some If you don't believe me, there's also a reference to the book that writes it. And this is the way how we decided at the beginning. But truly, isn't there a better way? And we went this path, but still something seems off. And what we miss at the beginning, but we will realize it later, is that there is a third option, which is about requesting some additional stuff. Requesting some much better. Requesting some additional stuff, some additional operation as a totally new resources. So instead of making a cancel on order, we can request cancellation of order. In this case, we are creating a new resource, we are creating a new request to the store. This request can be put on the queue, so we can return 200 to accept it, and later we can give update if operations succeed or not. So the get operation actually makes totally sense here, because you have the endpoint that shows you the status. Of course, with the cancel operation, it seems straightforward, but for the longer operation or something that requires some additional update, it's a great pattern that could solve many of our issues. So something like that, we still have a cancel with the previous implementation that I would say right now that it's not the path to go. So my conclusion after this is that our first idea to put verbs, even though some says that is RESTful, I wouldn't go this path anymore and use the request-based queries or comments to the REST API, which is much more convenient. It's much simpler. It works perfectly with API platform. It seems much more RESTful than putting just verbs at the end of the words. The second thing that we work with and we need to solve is some calculated data. So everything works perfectly when you have entity, and this entity has all the data stored in the database, and it's just your read model as well, and you're just putting it to the customer. That's working great. But let's be honest, the reality is not that simple. Sometimes we need to calculate something. Sometimes there are fields that are not easily mapped to the database. And this is this case. For our example, I will take cost of shipment. When the customer goes through the shop, there are different shipments. Each of the shipment has different calculation rules. And these calculation rules may depend on channel in which customer is making some shopping, on address, so where the shipping will be delivered, on items in the packages, because some delivery will count per item, some will just have a flat price, and some many more things if someone will customize Cilius to do it. So there are different possibilities how to count it. And I guess we all can agree that sending all this configuration to the front end and leaving them the calculation is not the good choice. So how we can do it that we'll calculate everything in the back end and send it directly to the customer? The most straightforward option, just put another field on our entity and throw it out to the customer. So it would look something like that. So I will put some public value that will be never mapped to the database. It's never used in the app, perhaps, because with the time, perhaps someone will use it for anything else. But the main point is that this is the field that would be mostly dead in the code, but it will be just serialized. And at least for me, it directly smells that something went wrong with the design. We shouldn't force our models to be exactly as our API is. So it's not a good option. The second possibility that we can check is to use custom read models. We already heard in the Kevin's, Robin and Mathieu presentation how to use them, especially with API Platform 3.0. But in our case, we just we tried this path. We just put additional entity in between two entities. So when shipping could return some shipping methods, we put some entity in the middle that had this direct relation to shipping method, but also contained the cost. And even though this solution seems the most perfect, the best from the architectural point of view, it's not that simple, especially if you select the path that only some objects will have custom read models. This means that most of the return types are not working perfectly. We need to teach API platform that in this particular case we will have something different. And it appeared that we had some custom providers, especially it was a part of SAP resource operation. So altogether, meant that for us, at this stage, about a year ago, was not way to go. Even though that right now, I would test it out and try to convince all of you that read models are probably the best approach for that. However, there's a third road that I will spoil it. We already selected. So it's adding dynamic fields. When you're working with Symfony Serializer, this is the graph that you could see a lot. So this is the path how the Symfony serialize data. And from the object, we are normalizing into the array. And then from the array, we are encoding it to some JSON operation. And in particular, in this place, we have a raw array that we can put any data there that is possible. There is one problem, though, that this field will never be mapped to OpenAPI documentation, which is also a blocker for us because we want to have everything exposed so you can trust our API reference. We solve it, adding a second class that will also enrich the API documentation with custom-made, handcrafted array that will put the particular field into documentation. It's not the best way to do it, but for us, it means that if you want to change something or you want to add something like that again to the project, it's actually registering one service with two functions to make it work, which is really not too much to override if you think about it. And other options like read models, when you consider that we are also a framework and we need to let you a way to customize what the view data will be, it's usually much more cumbersome because there will be some factories, some providers, etc., classes that will allow you to inject with your custom code. So even though the dynamic fields are not the perfect solution and they have many flaws, it was the best solution for us at this moment. But for the future, I would look again for a new API platform free data providers, and perhaps it can solve our problems and we can move more into read models, which is the way how you should design such stuff. Another point that I would like to cover is high-level API design. This is also quite controversial, what I will touch, but let's talk about unification of API. When we decide to go with API platform for our API integration, there already were two implementation of API for Cilius. One, it was old REST API that was crafted with FastREST, and second one that was mostly without any framework, that was REST-ish. It was called Shop API plugin and was meant to simplify the life of front-end developers. These two APIs were working totally different, and one of the ideas were to unify both of them. And the first idea that came to our mind is to serve all of it under one endpoint. So we would have API products endpoint, and if you're admin user, you see slightly different data, and if you are a regular user, you see slightly different data, but then we have the full unification. Not only API platform works the same under the hood, but also serves from the same endpoint. However, again, for us, for the framework case, we find a few problems with that. First of all, the serialization was not that simple, especially because some serialization group were depending on the login customer. It is possible with API platform, but was a little bit more complicated. The documentation was slightly off because it was always presenting you all the data that you can fetch there, but depending on the user, you receive different data. It requires us to define granular access control for each endpoint, and even though it's super powerful, it was a little bit cumbersome for us to cover all the cases. It is doable, but it would be just easier for us if there would be an easier way for that. We also decide that we would like to use in shop and admin different identifiers. The case was for shop that we would like to use Slack, so rather names of the product, and for the admin codes. So different identifiers make it impossible. And even though we withdrawn for the last decision, it was one of the reasons why we moved to that. Also, let's take a look into some data. First of all, we have 72 endpoints in shop in Cilius right now, where 64% of them are just read models. This is just reading product data, some details about product, etc. On the other hand, we have 128 admin endpoints, so we can see that the difference is huge, and 52% of it are just read endpoints. What I'm trying to say is that most of the write operation, of course, is happening in admin. So a lot of entities were just presented data to shop, while the whole management was on admin side. And only 20% of at the end 20% of our resources have some write capabilities in shop. My point is that these two APIs have a lot of differences. So it was also sometimes hard to track which endpoints are able to use what in which account. It wasn't either if we would need, probably we would need to write direct in documentation which endpoints are when usable. Another point is that when we take a look into the product data, for example, in admin, this is what you will. This is simplified object of product. So you'll see some code. There are translations for every language that is supported by the store. In the default implementation, there are 7 of them. There are some variants and some additional fields. While in the shop, you will see slightly different object. So this one. First of all, you can see that the translation field disappeared because we don't want, there was no point in serving all the translation to the shop, especially that we can determine in which locale the data should be presented already, mostly with accept with language header. They're different, the default variant, because product itself does not contain any price, so we need to add another field there. That does not make any sense in the admin panel. So these two objects, even though there are only 2 fields here, are already different. And the same difference may be found on any entity that has translation, has some pricing because we use channel pricing, etc. So data for shop was slightly different. And again, we have the problem that if we put it under one endpoint, the documentation about it says that all of this data is presented there, and you cannot directly trust it because you need to request and see what will be returned to you, because some data would be otherwise served as to admins and other data served to the shop user. So let's try to fix it. Perhaps we can just put some query parameter and serve admin data only when you request about it. And of course, it solves some of the available fields because then you're requesting, so you are aware that slightly different data will be served to you, even though, if I recall correctly, OpenAPI will not serve it in the documentation properly. But we still need to define granular access control, and it seems wrong from the REST perspective, at least for me, but perhaps I can learn something from you if it's okay to just put query parameter and change the serialization. Better option seems to be different header. So we can put to accept that we want this data in some different way of presenting. So we are serving the same resource, but just changing the representation of the data. We are using different header, and it seems that it's the most REST compliant way. So we are having the same resource, but just in the different representation. Unfortunately, from what I was trying, it's not easily supported by OpenAPI and API platform. It's much easier with API platform that with custom serializer we can do it, but still it requires some additional work. And also OpenAPI spec by default is not supporting dynamic structures, so we would need to change the way how it works, or also serve all the data that's possible to fetch from endpoint. It solves available fields depending on the user, but still requires granular access control for us. And the third option that we went through was to just put prefixes for these two APIs. The reasoning for that is that from our perspective, these two APIs are different. Even though under the hood they're the same resources, under the hood in the database, this is the same entity. There are totally different resources. They are differently serialized. It allows us to have available fields easily available for you. So when you read the documentation, you can just check the API at the beginning and you know which endpoints are for which user, when you're reviewing it, you can also see what fields will be directly served to you, not based on the additional dynamic serialization. This access control is straightforward. If you put API admin at the beginning of your endpoint, it will be protected by Symfony with access control. So you need to be logged in as admin. And it's a minor thing, but from our perspective, it was much more convenient and secure to just tell you that, okay, if you put admin at the beginning, then Symfony will take care of access control. You can also say that if it's REST compliant or not, there are different opinions. From what I heard tomorrow at 2, Darrell will tell you why our solution is bad. So perhaps you should just check the follow-up of this presentation. But on the other hand, if I'm want to present you that from the perspective of the design, if we are treating both of the resources as separate resources, for me it's fine that they have different IDs or different IRIs. And this actually is easily supported by OpenAPI and AP Platform. We went with this third option. And if you have different opinion why we should move back to Unified, I'm more than happy to hear you. But for us, that was the best decision based on the data that I presented you previously. The second elephant in the room is API versioning. So I already told you that we had old admin API, which was already versioned in the URL with V1. And the first version that we proposed was new API, so probably we will violate all the options that are there. But the idea was that there are several options and we didn't have time to review them, so let's just select any of them, even the worst one, and then we'll be forced to do something about it. So this is the worst one, and you should go that path. But then, what are the other options on the table? First of all, we can just continue URL-based versioning. So we can just put the next number there, and everything will be fine. Everyone will know which version to use. However, then we are making a straight line from our previous API, and this is against some of the ideas behind how the API should evolve. And the second way, also, it means that we have different representation of the resources. And the question is if the next version of API is a different resource for you. So should it have different IRI, or should we use the previous one and just evolve the API? The second option is to use accept headers. So again, we are discussing that IRI is representing exactly the same resource, but with accept header, we're just changing the representation. Therefore, we have old endpoint. With header, we are changing how it will be served, and then we are serving in the new version. And just a twist on this solution is to just use custom header that will also version our API. For us, the third option was not go, as we can already use the accept header, and why to use something new when we can just reuse what is already established as a best practice in community. So we are left with V2 or header, which seems to be much more REST compliant. In addition, this guy, Roy Fielding, already tweeted that if you are using versions in URL, you're putting middle finger into REST and you're doing RPC. And all in total, we decided for V2. The point was that even though we are aware that it's the wrong solution, we wanted to put it straight that we do not support the previous version. The previous version does not have anything in common with the V2, and this is something totally different. So we want to deprecate the old admin API and move to the new one. So we are aware that it's not the best decision, but putting the straight line here and telling people, okay, this is something totally new, was much better in our opinion. And from now on, we want to do it the REST way. So versioning endpoints also with the sunset header, so we'll be telling you when the header should be removed from our API and make it evolvement of API rather than writing a new V3. Deprecated endpoints with also OpenAPI specs, so you can check what will be removed in the next iteration. and write custom header, so it can also be versioned this way. So probably no more bumps in URL because it's the wrong path, but it was the best one for us for now. And the last part of the decisions that we had to choose is about API flow decision. In this case, we'll cover mostly cart and checkout, where we use a lot of command pattern. And first example will be about adding to cart. It seems to be simple, like you have some product identifier and you can put it to the cart. And I will present you now how it was implemented in Shop API plugin. First of all, you need to know that in Celius there are simple products. It means that it has only one variant. So by product, just by telling us which product you want to buy, you can already have it in the cart. Simple products require only product and quantity. But there are also configurable products in two different versions. First version requires you to select from the variants that are available. If there are only like 10 variants, you can put the select box. Customer will select which variant he is interested in, and this particular variant will be put to the cart. That is pretty straightforward. However, there's also a third option, and it was behind one endpoint, but three different behaviors. The third option is that you are telling us that you want to buy this product, and it has an customer selected these particular options, so we'll resolve it on the backend and put particular variant there. So it's the case when you have 125 t-shirts because you have 5 different colors, 5 different sizes, and 5 different prints on it. And if you just put 125 variants to select, probably customer will yell and run away. And when you have 5 select boxes, it's much easier to make shopping. But of course, it's not something that we consider to be a good solution. So we wanted to improve that. First of all, this is how the simple product add to cart looks like. This is how the configurable add to cart looks like. And I already told you that variants are simple product already has some variant, so we can say that these are more or less equivalent, but the first version was there for just convenience. But at the end, as we can simplify it to this one, and product variants are unique with the RIs, we can say that product is not needed anymore, because with the product variant we have all the information that is there, so we can simplify it to this endpoint, and there is only one way to add to the cart. But what with options? We drop this feature, and that's true, but it came also to us that mostly when you are building a front-end API, Aether, you already have price matrix in the UI because you already need to build this 125 different variants that will present you particular price. Or you can just ask us, so please tell me what is the variant for this particular option values. So just with the filter, you can, with additional query, you can ask us. And for us, it's much better default approach how to solve it, as you will anyway probably need to know the price before the product will be added there. And in some particular cases, when it's not the case, you can just customize the endpoint. And the last part that we cover, that I would like to cover with you, is order details endpoint. Let's take a look how it looks already in the Celius. First of all, when you take a cart summary page, you can see that there is the page with details about the product, the summary, but in the red box, you can see that there is an apply coupon, which is some different behavior than regular update to the cart. And in first iteration, we put different endpoint, mostly because it's work slightly different than regular update. We need to process the cart. There was some custom logic behind it. So perfect case for custom endpoint. And you can see already on the top that we went with this controller approach in this case. There is another update on the order. So when you have a billing, you have email address and some details. So we put address endpoint with email, billing address, etc. Because also it have different business logic behind it. We need to make a state machine transition in this particular case. So once you put address, you need to make some transition so the checkout will be fulfilled. We thought that we are forced to design it this way because mockups force us to see this data as different operations. We we had different data on both pages, so it was convenient. So you have different endpoint because you have some different logic here, and also state machine forced us, at least we thought so. So I already spoiling what will happen. Force us to make different endpoints, and we have different business rules for apply coupon. For example, email address was not always required. If you are logged in, we know your email address, so you can skip this endpoint, etc. Some of you may already start also telling me that why not use an update? Because there was already an endpoint for that, just to change the locale. Not the best usage of the update option. Because at the end, what we were just doing is just doing an order draft. So we were collecting information over several calls to finally be able to make some state transition. So when we change our attitude and think that, which is quite obvious, mockups should not force any design on us, and we can always use partial update or just take the data that is already stored in the local storage and send everything at once. And also, one of the tremendous moments for us, is there really a state machine? We use state machine because it was convenient for us to force UI design to follow it some rules, and with the state machine we protected how the UI flow. But with the API, it doesn't mean anything. You usually use one-page checkout anyway. Probably you can skip some operation and still it's valid order. So if you present it from the day one, some estimated shipping price based on the default address, and the customer wants to pay, why we are forcing you to make some state machine transitions? So at the end, we move to endpoint like this with just update with all the data. Probably we can consider to move it to the patch, so the partial update on this will be available as well. And if you're also noticing that there is no local update, it's because we also, following the principles of API design, move it back to the accept header. So if you're doing any request with accept with different language, we'll also put it on the order. So there is no update on the order with the local. We're just taking it from your request, as it should be with language. The conclusion is that we also learning how to design APIs use too much of the influence from the UI mockups and our old behaviors just because we designed it already this way, and it's not the way how it should work. And in this example, I hope that I also convinced you that we can do better. And finalizing my speech, some takeaways. If you would need to remember something from this presentation, this is the stuff that I would recommend. First of all, REST is with us for a long time and will be for longer. GraphQL is not going anywhere, but our decision to go by default with the REST, JSON LD and Hydra was a good decision, and I'm super happy about that. Secondly, if you have custom logic that do not map to your entities, just use new IP resource, state transitions, some operation. We already seen in the previous presentation how to use DTLs. This is the way how to solve it. And if you are thinking how to map it to the API design, just create a new resource from API perspective and then create it with the post. You have also get operations or updates if you need it. And the last one, which is quite obvious, do not map HTML based to your APIs. There are different products for different purposes, and just think bigger about it. Finishing my presentation, I would love to invite all of you to the SiliusCon, where there will be also something about the API design, but mostly about Silius. There will be, I already know that some of you or IP platform team will be there. It will be held in 1 month in Łódź, Poland, and with API_platform you have 10% discount if needed. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Thank you. Thank you, Lukas, for the talk. Maybe we have time for one question. So
I invite everyone for the champagne. Yeah. Okay, there is.
Hello, thanks for the talk. I was wondering if you face the situation to have a batch transition endpoint to move several entities or orders in the same time. And did you think about that?
No, we didn't. We didn't think as the okay. Everything that you have seen is from the shop perspective, and our default approach is to B2C. So the customer usually has only one card. That's why we didn't thought about it. The endpoint that I presented with the cancellation, this is how we are using, and usually there's only one ID. So no, we didn't thought about batch operation, and I do not have. I would lie if I will tell you that I have an idea how to design it just right away, so unfortunately. But I can think about it, and we can discuss it later.
Okay, thank you, Lucas. Another question, rapidly, maybe. There. Wait, the micro.
Wait a minute, and here is your mic.
Hello, thank you for our presentation. I never use the new API in Cilius. I always use Cilius, but with the shop bundle. And I wonder what happened when, in your last example, when you say you remove the checkout, the transition for the state machine. So when we have to put the transition because the order is fulfilled only if the checkout state is incomplete.
Perfect question. Yeah, we are still on the. We didn't move all the endpoints that we put the verb at the end of the path. And right now, to complete the checkout, you need to call the endpoint with complete at the end. But from my perspective, after these 2 years, I would say that before that, you have a drafting order, and then I would just make a post request on orders with the draft ID or something like that. So creation of order is something different and different endpoint than drafting an order and just updating the data that it's there. So right now I have verb at the end, but in the future I would love to have different endpoint for creation of order, because you need to say that, okay, for this data I want to have this draft to become an order. So different endpoint would be my answer.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lucas, for the talk.